"Get off my land." Amelia Carter said it before the man had even finished climbing down from his horse. Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't shake. The shotgun she was holding didn't shake either, and she'd had it pointed at Gerald Fitch's chest since the moment she recognized his black coat coming up the road. Fitch stopped with one boot in the stirrup and one on the ground and held both hands out to the sides. "Miss Carter, I know why you're here. The answer is no. It was no 6 weeks ago, and it's no today, and it'll be no the day the bank sends the sheriff out here with a piece of paper, and on that day, I will make considerably more trouble than I'm making right now." She cocked the hammer. "Get off my land, Mr. Fitch." He got. She stood in the yard and watched him ride until he was a black speck on the road, and then gone. And then she uncocked the hammer and lowered the gun, and stood there in the April mud, with her heart slamming against her ribs, and the ruins of her barn roof directly behind her, and absolutely no idea how she was going to save this farm. But she was going to save it. That much she knew. If this story is already in your chest, please subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay with me all the way to the end, because what happens on Carter Creek Farm before this is over will change everything you thought you knew about strength and home, and the kind of love that finds you when you've stopped believing you deserve it. The storm had come through 3 nights ago. Amelia had heard it building from the south around midnight. That particular low moan the wind made when it was serious, and she'd pulled on her boots and her father's old coat and gone out to check the barn latches. She'd done everything right. She'd double-tied the door, checked the hinge pins, moved the loose equipment away from the east wall. It hadn't mattered. By 2. In the morning, the wind was screaming, and by 3 o'clock, a sound like a gunshot cracked through the dark above her, and the east quarter of the roof tore loose. She stood in the barn below it and watched the sky open up above her head and the rain come straight down into the hay. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She got the cattle into the west stalls, piled what dry hay she could save into the corner farthest from the breach, and worked until her arms gave out. Then she sat down on a hay bale in the dark and rain and listened to everything her father had built coming apart above her. That was when she gave herself 2 minutes. It was a trick Harold Carter had taught her when she was 7 years old, standing in almost this exact spot after a calf had died, and she couldn't stop crying. He'd crouched down to her level and said, "Amelia Rose, you get 2 minutes. You feel it all the way down. Don't hold any of it back." And she'd cried as hard as she could for 2 minutes right there in the barn, and he'd let her. And then he'd said, "All right, now what do we do next?" She'd said through hiccups, We figure out what to do next." "That's right," he'd said. "We figure out what to do next." She sat in the dark, and the rain, and the wreck of the roof, and she took her 2 minutes. She felt the weight of the banknote. She felt the cold fact of the ruined hay. She felt the memory of Thomas Garrett standing in this yard with his hat in his hands, explaining in his careful voice that he'd been thinking about his future and what he needed it to look like, and she understood perfectly what he meant. She felt all of it, the years of looks, the years of small cruelties, the years of being measured and found wanting, not by anything she'd done, but by the body she lived in. The face she had, the size and shape of the space she occupied in the world. 2 minutes. Then she stood up, and she said out loud to the broken roof and the ruined hay and the dark Montana sky, "All right, what do we do next?" She figured out what to do next. In the morning, she rode to town. She went to the feed store first. Walt Pryor told her the storm damage up and down the valley was the worst since 1881, and she let him talk because sometimes men needed to frame a situation historically before they could be useful. When he was finished, she asked him who in Creekside did barn repair. He told her 3 men, all of whom she'd already known, were either unavailable, too expensive, or both. "There's one other," Walt said. He had the expression of a man about to say something that might land wrong. "Drifter came through 2 days ago, asking around for work. Fixed the water pump at the livery without being asked just because it was broken. Perry says he's the best barn man he's ever seen." A pause. "But he's not from around here. Doesn't say much about where he's from." "Does he do good work?" Amelia said. "Perry says he'd let the man build him a house." Where do I find him? She found him under a horse. He was flat on his back in the hay of Perry's livery, working at something on the mare's near hind shoe, with a pair of pliers, and the horse was standing perfectly still above him, which told her something. Nervous horses didn't stand still for strangers. Nervous horses stood still for people who were calm down to the bone. "Mister?" Amelia said. He slid out from underneath the mare and stood up in one motion, and she had her first look at Caleb Dawson. I wasn't what she'd expected, and she'd been careful not to expect much. He was tall and lean, and somewhere in his late 30s, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that the weather had spent considerable time on. His coat was old and clean, and his boots were worn through at the left heel, and his hands the thing she always looked at first, because her father had taught her that a man's hands told the truth, even when his mouth didn't. His hands were the hands of a man who had been doing physical work since he was very young, scarred and calloused, and entirely steady. But it was his eyes that stopped her. Not because of their color, which was a flat weathered gray, but because of what they did when they looked at her. They looked at her. Not at her body, not at the width of her hips, or the heaviness of her arms, or the fullness of her face. Just at her. The way you looked at a person you were actually planning to listen to. She had forgotten somewhere in the last several years that some people did that. "Ma'am," he said, "my name is Amelia Carter. I run Carter Creek Farm 4 miles east of town." She kept her voice flat and businesslike the way her father had taught her. "My main barn took serious damage in the storm. Quarter of the east roof gone, a wall gap. The main door hinge sheared off. I've got 2 months before the bank calls my note, and I need the barn tight before the next weather comes through." She looked at him straight. "I can't pay wages. I can offer the bunkhouse and 3 meals a day for the duration." I didn't flinch at the no wages. He didn't look at her with the particular expression of a man recalculating whether this was worth his time. He just said, "How are the joists?" "Sound far as I can tell." "Douglas fir original build?" "Yes. My father built it in 1871. Then it's salvageable. The roof damaged the wall. Those are surface problems if the frame's intact." He turned his hat in his hands once, then settled it back on his head. "I'll ride out tomorrow morning and look before I give you a real answer." "That's fair," she said. "Name's Caleb Dawson." "I know," she said. "Perry told me." He nodded. No elaboration, no inquiry about her situation, no comment on her property, or her ability to manage it, or whether she thought she was really up to this. Just a simple, direct negotiation between two adults, which was also something she had not experienced in longer than she wanted to admit. She rode back to Carter Creek in the late afternoon, with something careful and fragile sitting in her chest that she refused to call hope, because hope had let her down enough times that she handled it with gloves now. He arrived before she did the next morning. She came out of the house in the dark with 2 cups of coffee, and he was already at the east wall of the barn, running his palm along the gap in the boards. Not looking at it, feeling it. The way a doctor felt for a break beneath the skin. His horse was tied at the fence, still wearing its saddle steam coming off its neck in the cold air. She walked over and held out the coffee, and he took it without breaking his examination of the wall. "Thank you," he said. "What do you think? Your joists are good. You've got new lumber to source, but nothing exotic." He moved along, pressing here and there, listening to the wood in a way she couldn't quite describe. An attention to it, a kind of conversation. "Roof is worse than I'd like, but it's all surface damage. The original frame your father built is solid." He knew what he was doing. Something moved in her chest at that. Just those simple words, "he knew what he was doing," said about her father's work by a man who had just examined it with his hands and his full attention. "He did," she said. "I'll need to fabricate a new hinge for the door. You have a forge?" "Yes." 8 days, he said. "Maybe 9 if the weather's bad." "It'll be bad." 9 days then. He drank the coffee and handed the cup back. "I'll start this morning." He started, and he didn't stop. Every morning before she came out of the house, he was already at work. Every evening when she came back from the last cattle check. The lamp in the bunkhouse was still on, and she could hear him moving inside, cleaning tools, she supposed, or making notes, or doing whatever. It was a man like Caleb Dawson did, with the end of a day when he was mostly alone in the world. She noticed things about the way he worked, how he was quiet in a way that wasn't unfriendliness. It was more like a man who had learned that silence was less dangerous than words and had gotten comfortable in it. He never spoke first except about the work. He never offered information. But if she asked him a direct question, he answered it briefly, plainly, without evasion, and she began to understand that this was as close to open as Caleb Dawson got, and that it was in its own way a form of honesty. She also noticed that he fixed things she hadn't asked him to fix. The water trough in the East Corral had been leaking at the seam for 2 months. She'd been managing it with rags, checking it twice a day. On the second morning it was sealed clean, a proper repair done with the kind of material she wouldn't have thought to use. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. The chicken yard gate had been hanging wrong since the fall. She'd developed a particular lift and push with her right shoulder to get it open without fighting it. On the third day, it swung free. The porch step, the bottom one with the nail that had worked loose, and the board that had been giving slightly for 2 years, enough to catch the unwary foot. She'd stopped thinking about it consciously. She'd just adapted her stride. On the fourth evening, she stepped on it coming in from the last cattle check, and it held solid, and she stopped and stared down at it for a long moment. She looked out at the barn. The lamp was burning. She stood there on the solid porch step in the dark, and thought about what it meant that a man moved through a place and saw what was broken and fixed it. Not the things he'd been hired to fix. Just everything. Just all of it quietly, and without announcement. She thought about what kind of life built that habit in a person. Not the life of a man who'd always had somewhere to belong. Something closer to the opposite. On the 5th day, she brought lunch out to the barn. I was on the roof, fitting the new planks into the east section, and she stood below with the food and called up to him, and he came down, and they sat on the fence rail and ate, which was the first time they'd been still near each other for long enough to constitute a conversation. "How many barns?" she said. He chewed thought. 40 maybe. Lost count somewhere in Wyoming. Wyoming then, where Ty? Colorado. New Mexico for a winter. Utah coming north. What brought you this far north? He looked out across the pasture. Just how the road went. She let that sit for a moment. Then, you always work alone. Mostly. Nobody rides with you. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "There was somebody, long time ago." She didn't ask who. She could hear in the 2 words "long time ago" that this was a door with a lot of weight behind it, and she wasn't going to push it open uninvited. She understood about doors like that. "I had a fiancé," she said instead. Not sure why she said it, but it felt like an exchange. He'd offered something, and she could offer something back. 18 months ago, he stood right in this yard and told me he needed someone better suited to ranch life. She looked at the fence post. He meant someone who looked different from me. He just didn't have the guts to say it plain. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, his loss. Not with flourish. Not with elaborate feeling. Just 2 plain words, said the way he said everything, with the flat certainty of a man who believed what he said. She looked at him. He was already looking back at the roof, chewing the last of his sandwich, calculating the afternoon's work. She looked back at the pasture. His loss, she said quietly to herself, and found that for the first time when she thought about Thomas Garrett. The thing in her chest was not the old contracted grief, but something different, something that felt in a strange way like relief. On the 6th day, the town came. She heard them at the gate before she saw them, the particular sound of women's voices in a cluster which had a specific frequency that Amelia had learned to identify with the same precision she used to identify weather. She came around the side of the house and found 6 of them at the fence. Dorothea Hale in front. Edna Marsh beside her. 4 others ranged behind. Caleb was on the roof and did not come down. Amelia walked to the gate and stopped on her side of it. She didn't open it. "Amelia," Dorothea said in the voice she used when she was about to say something cruel and wanted it to sound like concern. "We've been worried about you." "Have you?" A man alone on a woman's property. A stranger, nobody knowing who he is or where he's from. His name is Caleb Dawson. He's repairing my barn. He sleeps in the bunkhouse and does his work and minds himself. Amelia kept her voice level. You've never worried about me before, Dorothea. What changed? Dorothea's expression did something complicated. We simply think you should be careful. A woman in your situation. What situation is that? A pause. Alone. Without family. I've been alone without family for a year and a half. You haven't ridden out once. Amelia. That was Edna Marsh in a softer voice that Amelia trusted less. We only mean to say a man like this offering to work for nothing. You have to wonder what he really wants. What he thinks he can get from a woman who... She stopped. From a woman who... What? Amelia said. Edna looked at her gloves. Say it, Amelia said. Her voice had gone very quiet. I'd like to hear you say it. We just mean, said Patricia Hale from the back of the group too quickly, that you should be realistic about what a man like that is likely to actually want from a woman like you. There it was. A woman like you. Amelia had been hearing that her whole life in different configurations. She was too much of this, and not enough of that, and no reasonable man would look at her without a calculation running behind his eyes. She knew every version of this sentence. She had grown up inside it. She had let it shrink her in ways she was still finding. But she was 30 years old, and she had pointed a shotgun at a bankman this morning, and she was done being shrunk. Patricia, she said, still quiet, still level. The last man who stood in this yard and told me what I was worth walked away and married a woman who left him inside a year. The man on my roof right now showed up before sunrise, works until dark, and has fixed every broken thing on this property without being asked. She looked at all of them one by one. When you have a man like that in your lives, you come back and tell me what I should be realistic about. Until then, get away from my gate. None of them moved for a moment. Then Dorothea said in a different kind of voice, not cruel, not soft, just stripped down. People are talking, Amelia. Let them, Amelia said. I've got a barn to finish. She walked back toward the barn without looking back. She heard them at the gate for another minute, their voices lower now, and then the sound of horses moving away. She didn't catch all of it. She caught enough. She heard the word desperate, and she heard the phrase no better than she should be, and she heard just before they rounded the bend, Dorothea's voice saying she'll regret it. She kept walking. Caleb was on the roof. He'd heard all of it. She knew he'd heard it because when she came into the barn below him, he drove 3 nails in a row without stopping, and the rhythm of it was slightly different from his usual rhythm, faster, sharper. She didn't say anything about the women. After a moment he did. You handled that well, he said from above. He didn't stop working. I've had practice. A beat. Then, they talk like that often, since my father died, before that mostly. She looked up at him. They've never thought I was capable of running this place. They've just had different reasons at different times. He drove another nail. Then, what did your father think? She felt the question land somewhere in the center of her. He thought I was the best thing he ever built, she said. Silence from the roof. Then, he was right. She looked down at the barn floor. She blinked once. She was not going to cry in front of this man over a compliment. However direct, and however unexpected, and however much it had found the exact wound she'd been carrying around for 18 months. Get back to work, Dawson, she said. From above, what might have been the smallest sound of a laugh. She turned away so he wouldn't see her face. She was smiling. That evening she came out to the bunkhouse step where he sat to smoke his pipe, which was his habit after supper, and she leaned against the post and looked at the stars, and they were quiet together for a while. Then she said, "What are you running from?" She'd told herself she wasn't going to ask it directly, but she was tired of going around things. He didn't answer right away. He pulled on his pipe and let the smoke out slow. Then he said, "What makes you think I'm running?" "Because you know every broken thing on a property better than the person who lives there," she said. "Because you fix things that don't belong to you without being asked. Because you've been to Wyoming and Colorado and New Mexico and Utah and Montana, and you've never once mentioned any of it like a place you were glad to see." She paused. A man who was just passing through wouldn't do all that. A man who was running would. Because when you're running, you pour everything you've got into the place you're in right now, because you know you're not going to be there tomorrow, and it's the only way to feel like you meant something. Very long silence. The pipe smoke moved out across the dark yard. There was an accident, he said. Back in Texas. Long time ago. His voice was quiet and flat, and she understood it was flat, because that was the only way he could say it. My fault. My family. He stopped. After that I figured there were two kinds of people. The kind that belonged somewhere, and the kind that fixed things for the people who did. He paused. I figured out which kind I was. Who told you that? She said. Nobody had to tell me. Who told you that? She said again, same words, different weight. He looked at her then. That reading look, the one that didn't calculate, didn't evaluate, just read. You were a child, she said quietly. Whatever happened in Texas. You were young, and something went wrong, and you've spent every year since then paying for it by making sure you never have anything you could lose again. She held his gaze. I know because I've been doing the same thing. Something crossed his face that she didn't have a name for. Amelia. I'm not telling you what to do, she said. I'm just saying I recognize it. The way you recognized every broken thing on this property. She pushed off the post. Good night, Caleb. She went inside. She lay awake for a long time listening to the quiet of the farm, the cattle settling, the wind moving through the new planks on the roof. The planks Caleb had put there, the gate swinging easy, the step that held. She thought about what a man like that was building piece by piece on a piece of ground he'd already decided he was going to leave. She thought about the question that was sitting in her chest like a splinter working its way in, not ready yet to be pulled out. She thought about tomorrow. In the morning she woke up before first light and lay there in the dark and listened to the sound of a hammer already out in the yard. She dressed and made the coffee. She went out. Howe was at the barn wall, fitting the last boards into the gap, working in the early gray light with his lantern hung on the post beside him. And when she came across the yard, she could see his breath in the cold air and the clean line of the repaired wall coming together under his hands. She held out the coffee. He took it. They stood together and looked at the wall. That's it, he said. Gaps closed. It is, she said. Door hinge is done. I can set it this morning. He drank. South pasture water gate needs work. I saw it on my way around yesterday. She looked at him. He looked at the wall. Caleb, she said. Ma'am. Don't tell me everything else that needs fixing, just so you can stay without having to say you want to stay. He went very still. The coffee cup held halfway to his mouth. She waited. A long time passed. The sky went from gray to pale gold. A magpie cut across the field and was gone. I've never... He stopped, tried again. I don't know how to do that. Stay. No, she said. I don't think you do. Another long moment. The water gate's bad, he said. It'll flood the south pasture if it goes. I know, she said. Be ashamed to leave it. It would, she said. She could see him working through something. Some calculation she didn't have the terms for, some arithmetic he'd been running for years that had always come out the same answer, and was perhaps for the first time coming out different. He set the coffee cup on the fence post. I'll start on it after I set the door, he said. She nodded, turned toward the house. Amelia. She stopped. She looked back. Howe was looking at her with an expression that she would think about later when she was trying to name what it had been. Not gratitude, exactly. Not relief. Something closer to the look of a man who has been walking in the dark for a very long time and has just without expecting it seen a light. He didn't say anything else. He put his hat on and turned back to the barn. She went inside and made breakfast and listened to the sound of the hammer ringing out across the cold, bright yard, and Carter Creek Farm held itself around her like it always had, like it would keep doing, and the door hinge sang clean on its new steel pin. When he swung it wide and somewhere to the south, a bankman named Fitch was riding back toward town with a plan that Amelia Carter didn't know yet, but would. She would, and she would be ready. The South Pasture water gate took 2 days. Amelia knew this because she counted. Not in a way she'd ever admit to, not consciously, not out loud, but she was aware of each morning that Caleb Dawson's horse was still at the fence, and each evening that the bunkhouse lamp was still burning with the particular awareness of a woman who had spent too long watching things leave. I didn't talk much while he worked the gate. Neither did she. But she found reasons to be in that part of the pasture more than usual, checking the cattle, walking the fence line, doing tasks that could have waited. She told herself it was efficiency. She knew it wasn't. On the first morning she brought water out to him at midday, and he was knee-deep in the creek bed, his boots soaked through, rebuilding the gate's lower post from the base. He'd pulled the whole structure out and laid it on the bank, and she could see where the rot had gone deep into the wood up the post, nearly 2 feet invisible from the surface. "How bad?" she said. "Would have gone inside a month," he said. "Maybe sooner. One good rain and your whole south section floods." She looked at the rotted wood, at how invisible it had been. "I checked that gate in the fall." "You checked what you could see," he said. Not as criticism, just as fact. "Rot hides. It goes down before it goes wide." He pulled the bad post free and tossed it up on the bank. Same as most things. She thought about that the rest of the day. On the second afternoon she was mending fence in the west field when she heard hoofbeats on the road and looked up and felt her stomach drop. Gerald Fitch. Not alone this time. He had 2 men with him she didn't recognize, both riding good horses, both dressed like money, with that particular ease in the saddle of men who had never had to worry about whether the horse would still be theirs tomorrow. Fitch himself looked different from the morning she'd sent him off at gunpoint. More settled. Like a man who'd gone away and come back with reinforcements and was feeling comfortable about the arithmetic. He stopped at the fence line and lifted his hat. "Miss Carter," he said pleasantly, "I wonder if I might have a word." "You can have it from there," she said. He smiled. "Fair enough." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document and held it out, not offering it to her, just displaying it. "I've brought something I think you'll want to see. A formal offer, from Harlan Cross." The name hit her like cold water. Harlan Cross was not a bankman. He was not a creditor. He was the largest landowner in the county, had been for 15 years, since he'd bought out 3 failing operations in the drought of 1873, and he had the particular reputation of a man who didn't buy land so much as collect it, the way certain men collected debts. "Cross wants Carter Creek," she said. It came out flat. "Mr. Cross is prepared to settle your note in full," Fitch said, like he was offering her a gift. "Clear the debt entirely. And there's a sum besides, enough to start over comfortably. Somewhere with fewer complications." "Fewer complications," she said. "The farm has been struggling since your father passed. Everyone knows that. There's no shame in—" "How does Harlan Cross know about my note?" she said. "That's a private matter between me and the bank." Fitch smiled again, smaller this time. "Mr. Cross makes it his business to know about opportunities in the valley. He's been watching Carter Creek for some time." "He's been watching Carter Creek," she repeated slowly. "Miss Carter." "How long?" she said. "How long has he been watching?" A pause. Small but there. "I really couldn't say precisely. Since my father got sick," she said. Not a question. The arithmetic was suddenly very simple and very clear, the way numbers always became clear once you found the right frame for them. Harlan Cross had been waiting. He'd been waiting while her father was dying, and he'd been watching the banknote, and he'd sent Fitch out the first time to assess whether she'd crack under pressure. And when she hadn't cracked, he'd come back with a formal offer, and 2 men on good horses, to make the weight of it feel more real. "You tell Harlan Cross," she said, "that Carter Creek Farm is not an opportunity. It is my home, my father's home, and the answer is no. Miss Carter, I strongly advise you to consider." "I've considered it," she said. "No, get off my fence line." Fitch looked at her for a long moment. That smile was entirely gone now, and what was underneath it was something she'd seen before in men like this. Not anger, which would have been more honest, but a flat, cold patience. The patience of a man who already knew how this ended and was willing to wait. "You have until the note comes due," he said. "After that, the conversation will look different." He touched his hat and turned his horse, and the two men turned with him, and she stood at the fence and watched them go with her hands gripping the fence rail hard enough to hurt. She stood there for a full minute after they were gone. Then she turned and walked toward the south pasture. "Caleb," she said. He straightened up from the gatework. He'd heard the hoofbeats. He'd heard the voices. She could see it in his face, the careful, attentive stillness of a man who had trained himself to know when something was coming. "Harlan Cross," she said. "You know that name?" Something moved in his face, quick and then gone. "I've heard it," he said. "I wants this land, has for a while looks like." She watched him. "You asked about Fitch, about who the interested parties were, that first day he came out." "I did." "You knew it was Cross." He was quiet for a moment. "I suspected," he said. "I've seen Cross work before. Different state, different name on the ranch, same pattern." He set down the post driver. A bankman comes out friendly talking about options. Then a formal offer. Then if neither of those works. He stopped. "Then what?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Then it gets less friendly." She felt the truth of that in her stomach. Not fear exactly. She'd lived on this land her whole life, and she'd looked at hard things before. But a new kind of cold clarity, the kind that told her the problem was bigger than a ruined roof and a failing note. "What did he do?" she said. "The other ranch, in whatever state." Caleb looked out across the pasture. His jaw tightened once. "He manufactured a debt," he said. "Convinced the bank to call the note early on a technicality. By the time the family figured out what had happened, it was too late." He paused. "There were 3 kids in that family." Silence. "You were there," she said. "I fixed their barn the winter before it happened." He said it like a man placing a stone down carefully, the way you set something down that you'd been carrying too long. "I moved on before the end. I didn't know until later what Cross had done." A long pause. "I should have seen it coming. I should have said something." She looked at him. At the weight in his face that she'd seen since the first day, that specific gravity of a man who had been holding himself accountable for something across a lot of years and a lot of miles. "Caleb," she said, "that wasn't your fault." "I knew the pattern," he said. "I'd seen men like Fitch before. You were a hired hand who fixed their barn. It wasn't yours to fight." He looked at her, and she could see him wanting to argue it, and not quite being able to find the argument. He said very quietly, "Maybe not." "But this one is mine," she said. "And I'm going to need to know everything you know about how Cross operates." He picked up the post driver. "Then let me finish this gate first," he said. "And tonight we talk." She nodded and went back to the fence line, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk turned wide circles over the south field, and Carter Creek Farm went quiet, except for the sound of Caleb driving posts and the wind moving through the grass. That night they sat at the kitchen table. It was the first time he'd been in the house proper past the porch. She hadn't thought about it when she invited him. She'd just said, "Come inside," and he'd come leaving his hat on the porch hook and his boots at the door with a natural courtesy that she noticed because it was not performed. It was just how he moved through a space that belonged to someone else. With care. She put coffee on and got out the ledger and laid it on the table between them. "Here's what I have," she said. "The note is $900. I've got 2 months. The spring calves go to market in 6 weeks, which gets me roughly $400 if prices hold." She pulled the ledger around. "I need $500 more. I've got the hay loss, which costs me either money I don't have or cattle I can't afford to sell. And Cross is sitting at the edge of it all waiting." Caleb looked at the ledger. His finger moved down the column of numbers, slowly reading it, the way she'd seen him read the barn wall, not just seeing it, but feeling for what was underneath. "Your cattle count," he said. "What's the full herd?" 32 head. "What's your keeping number minimum to stay viable as an operation?" 20. "So 12 head available for sale beyond your spring calves." He looked up. "At current prices, that's not enough," she said. "And selling down that far hurts next year." "What about the north pasture?" He glanced at the ledger. "You've got it listed as unused." "It is. It was my father's kitchen garden before he got sick. Too small for cattle rotation, wrong soil for crops. Lease it, Caleb said. She looked at him. Walt Pryor at the feed store has been looking for pasture to run his wife's horses. He mentioned it when I was in town. 3 mares. He can't afford to buy, but he'd pay lease. He held her gaze. It's not a fortune, but it's something. And something added to something is better than waiting. She stared at the ledger. She felt something that was not quite embarrassment and not quite shame, a shade of feeling that came from looking at a problem from only one angle for so long that you'd forgotten other angles existed. I didn't think of that, she said. You've been managing a crisis, he said. You don't see the edges when you're in the middle. You saw it in one day. He shrugged. I see things different. I come in from outside, no history with the place. It's easier. A pause. Not better, just different. She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them made his face softer than it looked in daylight, or maybe she was just looking at it differently. You're smarter than you let people think, she said. He gave her a look that was dry and quick. Not smart, just been around. Same thing sometimes. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close. There's something else, he said. The almost smile was gone. About Cross. If he's been watching this property and he's sent Fitch out twice the second time with a formal offer, he's on a timeline of his own. Which means something changed recently. Some reason he needs this land now more urgently than before. She frowned. What kind of reason? Railroad, Caleb said. There's a spur line being planned. I heard talk of it in town when I first came through. They're looking at routes through this valley. If Carter Creek sits on or near the likely corridor, she felt it hit her all at once. The clarity of it, the cold, ugly simplicity. Cross didn't want her cattle, or her pasture, or her barn. He wanted the land value that a railroad easement would create. He wanted to buy her out cheap before anyone else understood what the land was worth, and he'd been patient and strategic and working through the bank while she'd been too focused on the hay and the roof to see the real shape of what was coming. How do you know about the railroad? She said. Men who do the kind of work I do hear things, he said. I've followed that spur line rumor from 3 counties down. It changes where I look for work. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and let out a breath that had more in it than air. He's been playing a longer game than I knew, she said. Yes. And the bank does what men like Cross tell it to, he said, not bitterly, just as plain fact. Not every time, not everywhere, but in a county this size when a man owns as much as Cross does, yes. She brought her eyes back down to the table, to the ledger, to the numbers that had been her whole world for 6 months. All right, she said. So I need to pay the note before he can manufacture a reason to call it early. I need to do it with money I can prove is legitimate, and I need to do it before the railroad route gets confirmed, because once it does, the value of this land goes up, and Cross has even more reason to push. Yes, Caleb said. She looked at him. You've seen this pattern before. I have. Help me beat it. Silence. A long one. He looked at the table. At the ledger. At some point past her shoulder where she suspected he was looking at the shape of some decision he'd been running from for a long time. His hands were flat on the table still, and she watched them the way she always watched his hands because they told the truth, and what they were telling her right now was that he was here, fully here, in a way he maybe hadn't been anywhere in a long while. All right, he said. She reached across the table and put her hand briefly over his. 1 second, maybe 2. Then she pulled it back and picked up her pencil and opened the ledger. Then let's start with the north pasture, she said. She rode to Walt Pryor's place the next morning before 8 o'clock. Walt was in his yard when she came up feeding his chickens, and he turned with the usual mild surprise of a man who doesn't get many visitors before breakfast. Amelia, he said. Everything all right out your way? Everything's fine, she said. I want to talk to you about a lease arrangement, the north pasture. Walt went very still in the way of a man who suddenly realizes a conversation he'd wanted to have is happening without him having to start it. My mares, he said. 3 horses, reasonable rate, 6-month term. She folded her hands on the saddle horn. I need the income. You need the pasture. We can both stop pretending we don't." Walt looked at her for a moment. Then he started to smile, the slow, genuine kind that took a while to get all the way up his face. "Harold raised you right," he said. "He did," she said. "Do we have a deal?" They talked terms for 20 minutes and shook hands on it, and she rode back to Carter Creek with $80 secured, which wasn't enough, and was something, and something plus something was better than waiting. She was halfway home when she heard the horse behind her. She pulled up and turned, and the horse was coming fast from the direction of town, not dangerously, but with intention. And the rider was a young man she vaguely recognized as one of the hands from the cross operation east of town. He pulled up when she turned and looked at her with an expression that was both embarrassed and something else, something more uncomfortable. "Miss Carter," he said. "I don't know your name," she said. "Jed Anchors. I work for—" He stopped. "I ride for the cross spread." She waited. He pulled off his hat and turned it in his hands, which she recognized as a gesture she'd seen before, and recently. "I don't know if I should be telling you this," he said. "If Mr. Cross found out I'd—" He stopped again, looked at the road. "Fitch was in the Cross house last night, late. I was in the yard and I heard." He paused. "He's going to the bank Monday morning. There's a clause in your note, something about property maintenance structures being kept in sound repair. The roof damage from the storm." He met her eyes. "He's going to argue the damage puts you in breach." The cold was back, spreading fast this time. "The roof is fixed," she said. "He doesn't know that yet," Jed said. "Or maybe he does, and he thinks you can't prove it fast enough." He put his hat back on. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter. Your daddy was a good man. He helped my family a long time ago, and I—" He shook his head. "That's all I know." He turned his horse and rode back toward town. She sat on the road for 10 seconds. Then she turned and rode hard for Carter Creek. She came into the yard at a gallop, and Caleb was at the water trough, and he straightened up when he saw her face. "Fitch is going to the bank Monday," she said. "He's going to claim the storm damage puts me in breach of the maintenance clause in my note. He wants to call it early." Caleb was already moving toward the barn. "When did you hear this?" "Just now, from a hand at the cross place." She dismounted. "Monday gives me 2 days. The roof is sound," he said. "The wall is closed. The door is set." He turned to her. "We need documentation. Written record of the repairs materials used, condition of the structure. Something a bank examiner would have to accept." "Who'd write it?" she said. "Fitch will say it's self-serving if it comes from me." "Not from you," he said. "From me. I'm the one who did the repairs, and I'll need a witness." "Walt Pryor," she said immediately. "Can he come tomorrow?" "Yes," she said. "He'll come." "Then I'll spend tonight writing out a full account of the work, every repair, every material, every date." He looked at her steadily. "We beat the clock, that's all." "That's all," she said, and it almost sounded simple when he said it. She sent a rider to Walt that evening, and Walt sent back word that he'd be there by 9 Saturday morning. She sat up late at the kitchen table while Caleb worked by lamplight in the bunkhouse on the documentation, and she could see his shadow moving in the window across the yard, bent over the paper, writing in the careful, deliberate hand she'd noticed the one time she'd seen him write out a materials list. Not a man who had spent much time in school, a man who had taught himself what he needed to know. She brought him coffee at 10 o'clock. He looked up from the paper, and there were ink stains on his right hand, and he looked tired in the good, clean way of a man who was tired from work he'd chosen not from work that had been done to him. "How does it look?" she said. "Thorough," he said. "I've listed every repair with the date and material. The roof section has the board dimensions and the source of the lumber. I paid Perry's yard for some of it, so there's a purchase record. The wall measurements, the hinge fabrication." He paused. "It's not a lawyer's document, but it's honest, and it's specific. A bank examiner can verify every word of it." She looked at the pages spread across the bunkhouse table. 3 of them close-written, detailed. "You did all this tonight," she said. "I remember the work," he said simply. "Every joint, every nail. When you do something right, you remember it." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "And I don't just mean tonight." He looked down at the papers. "I told you I'd fix the barn." You fixed a lot more than the barn." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Get some sleep, Amelia. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." She went back to the house. She lay in the dark and thought about Monday morning and Fitch at the bank and the cold patience in his face when he'd looked at her over the fence. She thought about Harlan Cross, whom she'd never met, who had been circling this land for years while she went about her life not knowing she was being circled. She thought about her father. She thought about what Harold Carter would have done on a night like this, with a man like Cross in the picture and a banknote ticking down and the whole of the farm he'd built hanging in the balance. She thought he would have done exactly what she was doing. He would have worked every angle, called every ally, documented everything, and gone to sleep, because tomorrow required a rested mind. She went to sleep. Walt arrived at 9 on the dot, because Walt was the kind of man who arrived on the dot, and he spent 2 hours walking the barn with Caleb, who talked him through every repair with the same patient specificity he'd used on the documentation. Walt asked questions, good ones. The questions of a man who understood structures and knew what sound work looked like, and Caleb answered each one directly. And by the end of it, Walt signed the document as witness, with the particular satisfaction of a man who has just confirmed something he already suspected. "Best barn repair I've seen in 20 years, Walt said. He wasn't talking to either of them specifically, just saying it. The framework under that east section, he didn't just patch it, Amelia, he reinforced it. This barn's stronger now than it was before the storm." Amelia looked at Caleb. He was looking at the barn. "Any bankman who calls this a maintenance breach," Walt said, "is either a fool or a liar, and I'll say so in front of a judge if it comes to that." "It won't come to that," Amelia said. "But thank you, Walt." Walt left before noon, and Amelia rode to town in the afternoon to deliver a copy of the documentation to the bank directly addressed to the manager with a note in her own hand that laid out the timeline of repairs clearly and directly, and ended with a sentence she'd written 3 times before she got it right. Carter Creek Farm is in full compliance with all terms of its note, and any representation to the contrary is false. She handed it to the bank clerk and looked at him steadily until he confirmed he would place it on the manager's desk before end of business that day. She rode back to Carter Creek in the early evening with the sun going low and orange across the Montana grass, and the kind of tired that lived in your bones when you'd spent 2 days running hard at a problem. She came into the yard, and Caleb was at the porch step, sitting where he usually sat in the evenings, his pipe in his hand. He looked up when she came in. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. "Documentation filed. Walt's statement attached." He nodded. She tied her horse and came to the porch and sat down on the step beside him, which she had not done before. She'd always stood while he sat, and she sat there and let the evening settle around her, and didn't say anything for a while. The pipe smoke moved out across the yard. The cattle were quiet in the field. The barn stood against the darkening sky, tight and sound and rebuilt. "He's not going to stop," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," Caleb said. "He's not." "Monday's a delay, not a solution." "Yes." She looked at the barn. "Then we need a bigger solution." He didn't answer right away. He pulled on the pipe once slow. Then he said, "There might be one, if you're willing to go on the offensive instead of just defending." She turned to look at him. His face in the evening light was very still, the way it got when he was about to say something he'd been turning over for a while. "The railroad," she said. "The railroad," he said. She held his gaze. "Tell me," she said. And he did. The railroad plan was simple. That was what made it dangerous. Caleb laid it out on the kitchen table that night, with a stub of pencil and a piece of brown paper he'd torn from the feed sack in the barn, and he drew it, the way he explained everything. Straight lines, no decoration, no softening of the hard parts. "The spur line is coming through this valley," he said. "That's not rumor anymore. I talked to 3 men in town this week who've seen the survey crew working south of Billings. They're moving north." He put the pencil down on the paper. "The question isn't whether the railroad comes. The question is whose land it crosses when it does." Amelia looked at the rough map he'd drawn. Carter Creek Farm sat at the natural low point of the valley, the place where the land flattened and the creek ran easy and the ground gave no resistance. Every rancher in the area knew that. Her father had known it. It was why he'd chosen this spot 40 years ago. It was why Harlan Cross wanted it. If the railroad crosses Carter Creek, she said, the easement value alone is worth 5 times what Cross is offering you now, Caleb said. Minimum. She sat back. He's been planning this for years. Since before your father got sick, I'd wager. He looked at her steadily. He's patient. He waits for people to get desperate and then he moves. And his move right now is to call the note early. His move right now, Caleb said, is to scare you into selling before you find out what your land is actually worth. She stared at the brown paper map. She thought about Gerald Fitch's face, that cold, flat patience, and she understood it differently now. It wasn't the patience of a man who thought he might lose. It was the patience of a man who had already counted the cards and was just waiting for the other player to fold. So I don't fold, she said. You don't fold, Caleb said. You go to the railroad directly. The survey crew. Not the crew. Higher than that. He leaned forward. The railroad doesn't want to buy Cross's land. They want the best route through the valley. If you can show them Carter Creek is available and willing, that you'll negotiate an easement directly, fair terms, clean title. They don't need Cross at all. He loses his leverage the moment the railroad stops needing him to deliver the property. Amelia looked at him. You've thought about this for a while. Since Fitch's second visit, he said, when you told me Cross's name. She felt something shift in her chest. Not the fragile, hopeful thing she'd been so careful with, but something harder and more useful. Something that felt like a weapon being put in her hand. Who do I talk to? She said. At the railroad. The regional land agent. His name is Harrington. Works out of the Northern Pacific office in Billings. Caleb met her eyes. I know someone who knows him. I can get you a meeting. She looked at him. How do you know someone who knows a Northern Pacific land agent? A pause. Small, but she caught it. I've worked a lot of places, he said. You talk to a lot of people when you're always moving. She let it go, for now. How soon can you get the meeting? I'll ride to town tomorrow morning and send a wire, he said. Could have an answer by end of week. She nodded. She looked at the map again. Then she looked up at him. Caleb. If this works, if I get the easement and pay the note, and Cross loses his play, he's going to know someone helped me see it. He's going to want to know who. Let him wonder, Caleb said. He's not the kind of man who wonders quietly. No, he said. He's not. He looked at the map. But that's a problem for after. Right now we have Monday to get through. She stood up and collected the brown paper and folded it and put it in her apron pocket. Get some sleep, she said. You've got a long ride tomorrow. He stood. Amelia. She stopped. This is going to work, he said. Quiet. Certain. The way he said the barn would hold. She looked at him for a moment. It better, she said. Because I'm out of things to sell. He almost smiled. Good night. Good night, Caleb. She went inside and laid the map on the kitchen table and stood over it for a long time in the lamplight. Then she went to bed and slept straight through until dawn, which was the best sleep she'd had in 6 months. Monday came. She was up before the sun and dressed in her best, the dark blue dress, the good boots, her mother's brooch pinned at the collar, because she had learned from her father that you dressed for the fight you intended to win, not the fight you were afraid of losing. She rode into Creekside with her documentation folded clean in her saddlebag, and she walked into the Territorial Bank at 9 o'clock sharp and asked for the manager, Mr. Daniel Ehlers, by name. The clerk looked at her. The way clerks in this bank always looked at her, with the mild, reflexive dismissal of a man who has decided before you open your mouth what category of person you are. Mr. Ehlers is in a meeting, he said. I'll wait, she said. She sat down in the chair by the window and folded her hands in her lap and looked pleasantly at the middle distance, the way her father had taught her to wait, like a person who had nowhere better to be and all the time in the world. Fitch was already there. She saw him through the glass of Ehlers' office door, his black coat, his hat on his knee, that particular set of his shoulders, that meant he was talking to someone he expected to agree with him. There was another man with him she didn't recognize. Broad-shouldered, expensive coat. She had a feeling cold and specific that the broad-shouldered man was someone who had come from Cross himself. She kept her hands folded. She kept looking at the middle distance. 11 minutes later, the office door opened and Fitch came out. He saw her. Something crossed his face, surprise quickly controlled, then replaced by that flat measuring look. "Miss Carter," he said, "I didn't know you had business here today." "I have business here most Mondays," she said pleasantly. "It's where I bank." He looked at her for a moment, at her dress, her good boots, the calm in her face. She could see him running the calculation. Had she heard something? Did she know about the clause? She kept her face pleasant and told him nothing. He went back into the office. The clerk called her in 8 minutes later. Daniel Ehlers was a careful man, small, precise, the kind of man who organized his pencils. He was also, Amelia had always suspected, a man who was more afraid of Harlan Cross than he was of doing the wrong thing, which made him dangerous in a specific way. He greeted her politely and gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat, and she put the documentation on the desk before he could say a word. "I'm here to address the matter of Carter Creek Farm's compliance status," she said. "I understand there may be some question about the maintenance clause. I've brought documentation of all repairs completed following the April storm, witnessed and signed by Walter Pryor, who I understand is known to this bank as a man of sound judgment." Ehlers picked up the documentation and looked at it. He was very still while he read. She waited. She could hear the clock on the wall. She could hear someone moving in the outer office. Ehlers set the documentation down. He looked at her. "This is thorough," he said, carefully, like a man choosing each word. "It is," she said, "because the repairs were thorough." A pause. "Mr. Fitch has raised some concerns." "Mr. Fitch represents interests that are not this bank's interests," she said. "He represents a private buyer who would benefit from my note being called early. I'd ask you to be clear in your own mind about whose interests you're serving when you consider his concerns." Ehlers blinked. She kept her voice even. "The note is current. The property is in sound repair, better repair than before the storm. In fact, as Walt Pryor's statement details, I am not in breach of any clause, and I intend to pay this note in full before it comes due." She looked at him. "Is there anything in this documentation that suggests otherwise?" He looked at the papers again. A long moment. "No," he said. "There is not." "Then we're in agreement," she said. She stood and held out her hand, and he shook it with the automatic reflex of a man who had just been outmaneuvered and was still working out exactly how it had happened. She walked out of the bank into the April sunshine and stood on the boardwalk and let herself have 3 full seconds of something that was not quite triumph but was its close neighbor. Then she put her foot in the stirrup and rode back to Carter Creek. Caleb was at the fence when she came in. He read her face before she said a word. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. "For now." He nodded. "Wire came back this morning. Harrington will meet with you Friday. Billings." She stopped, looked at him. "That fast?" "I told you I knew someone," he said. She swung down from the horse. She stood there for a moment with the reins in her hand and looked at him, at the steadiness of him, at the way he stood in her yard, like a man who had decided somewhere in the last 2 weeks to plant his feet. "Who are you?" she said, not unkindly. He held her gaze. "Just a man who fixes barns." "No," she said. "You're not." He looked away first. "Friday," he said. "I'll ride with you if you want." "I want," she said. He went back to the fence work. She went inside and stood at the kitchen window and watched him, and thought about the way he'd said, "I told you." "I knew someone," the slight flatness in his voice that told her there was more behind it than he was saying. She had learned to recognize that flatness. It was the sound of a man carefully not saying something. She filed it away. She was getting good at that. The town found out about Monday before Tuesday. She didn't know how this was the particular mystery of small towns, the way information moved through them like water through cracked ground everywhere before you'd seen it go anywhere. By Tuesday morning, Dorothea Hale had told her sister, who had told the Reverend's wife, who had presumably told everyone else, and the story that reached Amelia by Tuesday afternoon was that she had walked into the bank and made a scene, and threatened Mr. Ellers, and stormed out. She had not made a scene. She had been exceptionally calm, which she suspected was what had bothered people most. But the version people told was more interesting than the truth, and it had an addition that the truth didn't have, that Caleb Dawson had put her up to it. That he had coached her, planned it, used her as a front for some scheme of his own. Amelia heard this from Hank Dawes' wife on Tuesday afternoon, and she stood in Hank's yard and listened to the whole of it without interrupting. "People are saying he's not what he seems," Hank's wife Clara said, uncomfortable but determined. She was a good woman who didn't like conflict, but felt its pull when she thought something was wrong. "That he showed up too convenient. Right after the storm. Right when you were in trouble. He showed up because Perry told me he was in town, and I went and asked him for work," Amelia said. "But nobody knows where he's from," Clara said. "And he won't say. And now he's involved in your business with the bank and people are—" She stopped. "Amelia, I'm saying this because I like you. People are talking about you. Badly. And some of it is the usual cruelty, I know that. But some of it is—" She paused. "He's a stranger. You let him in very fast." Amelia looked at her. She thought about what she knew of Caleb Dawson, which was this: he arrived before the sun, he left after the dark, he fixed things nobody asked him to fix. He'd spent 2 days building her a case to take to the bank. He'd gotten her a meeting with a railroad land agent in 3 days, and the one time she'd seen real feeling in his face was when he'd talked about the family in whatever other state where he hadn't spoken up fast enough. "Clara," she said, "I've known Thomas Garrett my whole life, and he stood in my yard and told me I wasn't worth standing beside. I've known half the men in this county since I was born, and most of them have made sure I knew exactly what they thought I was worth." She held Clara's eyes. "I've known Caleb Dawson 2 weeks, and he has not once looked at me like I was less than what I am." Clara was quiet. "So yes," Amelia said, "I let him in fast, because fast and right beats slow and wrong every time." She went home. She was halfway up the porch steps when she heard hoofbeats coming hard up the road, and she turned, and the rider was Jed Ankers again, and his face was different from the last time. Not embarrassed now, actually afraid. He pulled up, and his horse was lathered. "Miss Carter," he said, "you need to know something. Now." She came down the steps. "Tell me." "Cross knows about the railroad," he said. "He knows you know. Someone told him, I don't know who, but he knows you're planning to go to Billings." He pulled a ragged breath. "He's sending men, not Fitch. Different men. He wants to—" He stopped, looked over his shoulder. "He said he wants the situation resolved before Friday." Her stomach dropped straight through the ground. "What does that mean?" she said. "Resolved how?" Jed looked at her with the eyes of a young man who had been working for a bad man long enough to know exactly what resolved meant and hated that he knew it. "Don't go to Billings alone," he said. "Don't go anywhere alone." He turned his horse. "That's all I can tell you. I'm sorry, Miss Carter." He rode. She stood in the yard with the sound of his horse fading and the evening going quiet around her, and the word resolved sitting in her chest like a stone. She went straight to the barn. "Caleb," she said. He came out from the back stall. He read her face in one look. "What happened?" he said. She told him, all of it. Jed's face, his horse lathered, the word resolved. "Don't go anywhere alone." Caleb was very still while she talked. When she finished, he was quiet for 3 seconds. She counted them. Then he said, "He knows about the meeting." "Yes. Someone in Billings told him, or someone here did." He looked past her. "It doesn't matter which. What matters is, Cross is moving faster than I expected." He looked at her. "You're not going to Billings alone." "I know. I wasn't planning to." "I'm going with you, and I'm going to get someone else." "Who?" He pulled his hat off and turned it in his hands once. "Walt Pryor, and Hank Dawes if he'll come. 3 people besides yourself is enough that Cross's men won't move openly." He met her eyes. "He doesn't want a scene. He wants a quiet resolution. We make it impossible to be quiet." She looked at him. "You've dealt with this kind of thing before?" "Yes," he said. "Just yes. No elaboration. She had about 40 questions she wanted to ask, and she pushed all of them aside because Friday was 3 days away, and she needed him thinking about the plan, not defending his past. "Talk to Walt tonight," she said. "I'll talk to Hank." He nodded. He started toward his horse, then stopped. "Amelia," he turned. "Lock the house tonight. All of it." She held his gaze. "You think he'd move before Friday?" "I think Cross is a man who likes things resolved quietly and quickly and on his schedule," he said. "And I think Jed Anchors scared himself coming here, which means whatever he heard was bad enough to scare him." He paused. "Lock the house." She locked the house. She didn't sleep much. She lay in the dark and listened to the farm, every creak of the porch, every shift of wind against the windows, and she thought about her father building this place, board by board and nail by nail, and she thought about Harlan Cross circling it for years, like a patient ugly thing, and she felt something that was not fear but was adjacent to it move through her and settle. She let it settle. Then she got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table until the sky went gray. And when it did, she heard Caleb's boots on the porch and a quiet knock. She opened the door. He had his coat on and his hat in his hand, and the flat gray of his eyes was very alert in the early light. "Walt's in," he said. "He'll meet us in town Thursday evening. We ride for Billings early Friday." "Hank," she said. "Ride over this morning," he said. "I think he'll come. He's that kind of man." She handed him the second cup of coffee. He took it. They stood in the doorway in the early gray and drank their coffee, and neither of them said anything, and it was the kind of silence that had something solid in it, something that didn't need to be filled. Then he said quietly, "You're not going to lose this farm." She looked at him. "I know," she said. Hank came by mid-morning and said yes before she'd finished explaining which was the thing about Hank Dawes that she'd always valued most. He made decisions fast when they were the right decisions, and he never needed the reason to be explained twice. His wife Clara stood in the background of their kitchen with her hands twisted together and her eyes on Amelia's face. And when Hank said yes and turned to get his coat, Clara crossed the room and took Amelia's hand. "I'm sorry," Clara said quietly, "for what I said yesterday, about letting him in fast." Amelia squeezed her hand. "You were being a friend." "I was being a coward and calling it concern." Clara looked at her directly. "He's a good man, I can see it. I just got scared for you." "I'm a little scared too," Amelia said honestly. "But scared and stopped are different things." Clara almost smiled. "Your daddy used to say something like that." "I know," Amelia said. "He said it to me about 60 times. She rode back to Carter Creek and found Caleb at the barn, finishing a repair on the south stall door that she hadn't asked him to do and hadn't even noticed needed doing. She stood in the barn door and watched him work, and she thought about what Clara had said. "He's a good man. I can see it." And she thought about how long it had taken her to see it, and how fast she'd seen it once she stopped looking at him through the town's eyes. "We're set," she said. "Hank's in." He drove the last nail and stepped back to check the hang of the door. "Good." She leaned against the doorframe. "Caleb, when this is done, when Friday's done and the note's paid and Cross is out of the picture." She paused. "What are you going to do?" I was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the door he'd just fixed. "Hadn't thought past Friday," he said. "That's not true," she said. He turned and looked at her. "You've been thinking about it," she said. "I can tell. Same way I can tell when you fix something that wasn't on the list. There's a reason for everything you do, even when you won't say the reason." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he came and leaned against the opposite side of the barn door, and the two of them stood facing each other across the doorframe in the pale morning light. "I think about leaving every morning," he said. "When I first wake up, it's habit. Figure out the road, figure out which direction, figure out what comes next." He looked at his hands. "This is the first place in a long time where by the time I've had my coffee I've stopped thinking about it." She didn't say anything. She let the words sit. "That scares me more than Cross does," he said. "I know," she said. He looked up at her. "It scares me too," she said. "But scared and stopped are different things." Something moved across his face. slow and unguarded and real. The kind of expression she'd only seen from him in unguarded moments, and then he straightened and pulled his hat on. "We should go over the plan for Friday," he said. "We should," she agreed. But she was smiling, and he saw it, and he looked away with something at the corner of his mouth that she was almost certain was a smile of his own. Wednesday passed in preparation. Thursday they rode to town and met Walt at the hotel, and the three of them Walt. Caleb Amelia sat in the corner of the hotel dining room and went through everything. The documentation, the approach, what to say to Harrington and what not to say, how to handle it if Cross's men showed up in Billings. Walt ordered the beef and ate steadily through the whole conversation with the calm of a man who had been through hard things before and knew that eating was important. Caleb drank coffee and talked through the plan in the same way he talked through barn repairs, sequentially. No step assumed, no detail too small. Amelia listened to both of them and said what she needed to say, and felt in the particular quality of the evening, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt like she was not alone in something. Not just not alone. Backed. She had people behind her. Not because they'd been pushed or obligated or shamed into it, but because they'd chosen it. Walt because her father had been his friend, and because he was that kind of man. Hank because he was that other kind of man. And Caleb because she looked at him across the table. Because he'd been running for years and had stopped running in her yard, and whatever reason lay behind that was his own, and she wasn't going to pull it open. But she could see it in the set of his shoulders, and the way he'd planned every step of this, and the way he looked at Carter Creek watching like a man who was in the process of deciding something enormous. She looked away before he caught her. They left Creekside before dawn Friday morning. 4 of them, Amelia, Caleb, Walt, Hank. They rode in a group, and they made good time on the Billings Road, and the morning was cold and clear, and the mountains were sharp on the western horizon. Nobody talked much, the kind of quiet that lived before something important. They were 2 hours out of Creekside when Hank said, "Riders behind us." Amelia didn't turn immediately. "How many?" 2, Hank said. "Been with us since the fork," Caleb said without looking back. "They're not going to move on an open road in daylight with 4 of us. They're watching." "Reporting back to Cross," Walt said. "Yes." Caleb kept his eyes forward. "Let them watch. Let them ride. We keep going." Amelia kept her eyes on the road ahead. On Billings. On the meeting. On the number that would save Carter Creek Farm if she said the right things in the right room to the right man. She kept riding. The riders behind them kept their distance all the way to the edge of Billings, and then disappeared into the town's bustle, and Amelia thought she caught a glimpse of one of them, a broad-shouldered coat, the kind that cost money before he turned a corner and was gone. The Northern Pacific Land Office was on the main street 2 floors with the railroad's name painted clean across the front. Harrington was waiting. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-40s with an efficient manner and the eyes of a man who looked at land and saw numbers, but was not. She thought a bad man. He shook her hand without hesitation. He shook Caleb's hand, and something passed between the 2 men when they shook a recognition brief contained. So Caleb did know him, more than casually. She filed that away and sat down. "Miss Carter," Harrington said, "I understand you're here about an easement proposal for the Carter Creek property." "I am," she said, "and I think you're going to want to hear what I have to offer." She put her father's deed on the table. She put her survey maps beside it. She put the documentation of the barn repairs on top of that, not because it was relevant to the railroad, but because it told Harrington something about who he was dealing with. A woman who documented things. A woman who showed up with proof. "Carter Creek Farm sits at the lowest crossing point in the valley," she said. "Your survey crew has been working south to north along this corridor for 6 weeks. You already know this is the optimal route." She held his eyes. "I'm prepared to negotiate a fair easement on terms that work for both of us. Clean title, no liens, no competing claims, no complications." She paused. "What I am not, Mr. Harrington, is Harlan Cross's property to be delivered to you at his convenience." Harrington was very still. "You know about Cross," he said. "I know he's been trying to acquire my land specifically to control access to this route," she said. I know he's been pressuring my bank. I know he's had men following me since I left Creekside this morning. She looked at him steadily. I'm offering you a simpler arrangement. Deal with me directly. Cut Cross out entirely. Silence. Harrington looked at Caleb. Caleb said nothing. He met Harrington's eyes and held them and waited. Harrington looked back at Amelia. The railroad does not get involved in private land disputes, he said slowly. I'm not asking you to, she said. I'm asking you to do business with the person who actually owns the land. She kept her voice flat and her hands still. Is there a reason to do otherwise? Very long silence. Harrington picked up the deed. He read it. He set it down. He looked at the survey map. I would need to bring this to the regional director, he said carefully. Of course, she said. There are processes. I understand, she said. I'm not asking for an answer today. I'm asking for the meeting to have happened, for the door to be open. He looked at her for a long moment. The door, he said slowly, is open, Miss Carter. She felt Walt shift in his chair beside her. She felt Caleb's stillness, which was the stillness of a man holding his breath. She extended her hand. Harrington shook it. She stood and gathered her papers, taking her time, not rushing the way her father had taught her to leave a room like a person who had come to do something and done it, and was satisfied. They were outside and halfway down the street before Walt said under his breath, Lord Almighty, girl. She kept walking. Don't celebrate yet, she said. The door is open, Walt said. The door is open, she agreed. Cross still has moves. Let him make them, Hank said from her other side. She looked at Caleb. He was looking at the street ahead, and his face had the quality she'd learned to read over the past weeks, the controlled quiet of a man working through something. Harrington, she said quietly. You know him. A beat. We've met. More than met. He glanced at her sideways. I'll explain it. Yes, she said. You will, but not here. He nodded. Not here. They rode back to Creekside in the afternoon. The riders Cross had sent did not follow them home. She thought about what that meant, whether Cross had already heard, whether someone in the land office had sent word, whether he was already recalculating. She thought about the flat patience in Fitch's face, and whether patience had a limit, and what happened when a man like Cross hit it. She thought about what came next. She was almost home. The lights of Carter Creek just visible through the dark when Caleb pulled his horse up beside hers and said quietly, When I was in Texas, I had a partner. We were doing contract work, building mostly, and my partner got into debt with a man a lot like Cross. And I knew the man was bad, and I knew the debt was wrong, and I didn't say anything because I thought it wasn't my place. His voice was flat and even, and she understood that flatness now, it was the only way he could say certain things. The man took everything my partner had. Everything. And I left because I didn't know what else to do. And I've been leaving ever since. She rode beside him and listened. I should have stayed, he said. I should have fought it. I didn't know how. He paused. I know how now. She looked at him in the dark. Is that why you're here? She said. Carter Creek. Is it because of Texas? He was quiet for a long moment. Maybe it started that way, he said. Maybe I saw Fitch, and I saw the pattern, and I thought I could fix it this time. He looked at her. But that's not why I'm staying. Her heart did something complicated. Caleb. Don't, he said, not harshly, gently. Not tonight. Tonight, let's just get home. She looked at the lights of Carter Creek ahead. Home. He'd said home. She wondered if he'd heard himself say it. She didn't point it out. She rode beside him through the dark Montana night toward the lights of the farm, and the stars were very close, and the air was cold and clean, and somewhere behind them, Harlan Cross was sitting in his big house recalculating, and somewhere ahead of them, Friday had become something other than just a meeting. It had become the first day of a fight they were going to have to finish, and for the first time since the storm tore the roof off her barn, Amelia Carter did not feel like she was fighting alone. Cross moved on Saturday. Amelia was at the breakfast table when she heard the horses, not one, not two, but several, coming up the road at a pace that was not casual. She was at the window before the sound registered fully in her mind, and what she saw made her set her coffee cup down very carefully on the table, so she wouldn't drop it. 4 riders. Fitch in front. The 2 men from Billings flanking him. And behind them on a gray horse that cost more than most men in Creekside earned in a year, a man she had never seen in person, but recognized immediately from the way he rode, like a man who had never once considered that any piece of ground he crossed might not eventually be his. Harlan Cross had come himself. She heard Caleb come out of the bunkhouse before she reached the front door. He'd heard them too. Hy was standing in the yard when she came out, and he'd positioned himself. She noticed this, the way she noticed everything he did between the house and the approaching riders, which was not accidental. She came to stand beside him. "He came himself," she said quietly. "I know," Caleb said. His voice was flat. "That means he's not here to negotiate." Cross pulled up at the yard gate and looked at the 2 of them standing together, and something moved across his face. Not surprise, but a recalibration. He'd expected her alone, or he'd expected her afraid. He got neither, and she watched him adjust to that, the way a man adjusted a rifle sight. Hy was maybe 60, with a heavy face and pale eyes, and the particular physical presence of a man who had spent decades having things go the way he wanted. He wore good clothes and a good hat, and his hands on the reins were the soft hands of a man who had stopped doing physical work a long time ago. He looked at Caleb for a long moment. "Dawson," he said. Amelia felt something go through her, a cold, sharp thing. Cross knew his name. Caleb said nothing. His face was absolutely still. "I wondered if it was you," Cross said. He said it almost conversationally, like he was confirming a minor suspicion. "When Fitch told me someone was helping her, I thought that's the kind of thing Caleb Dawson would do." He tilted his head. "You always did have a habit of sticking your nose into other men's business." "Miss Carter," Amelia said, not to Cross, but to herself under her breath, steadying herself. Then louder to Cross directly. "Mr. Cross, you're on my land." Cross looked at her then. The way he looked at her made her understand something immediately. He was not a man who thought she mattered. She was a problem, a small one, an obstacle between him and a thing he wanted. He looked at her the way you looked at a stuck gate. "Miss Carter," he said pleasantly, "I've come to make you a final offer in person. I find that conversations like this go better face to face." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "The number is generous, more than generous. It accounts for the railroad easement value. Yes, I know about your meeting with Harrington, and it gives you a clean start somewhere that will suit you better." "Somewhere that will suit me better," she said. "Running a ranch of this size alone as well." He smiled, small and precise. "It's ambitious." "I'm not alone," she said. Cross looked at Caleb again. "No," he said. "I see that." Something shifted in his tone. "Which is actually what I wanted to discuss." He looked back at Amelia. "Miss Carter, do you know who Caleb Dawson is? Do you know where he came from?" She felt Caleb go very still beside her. "I know who he is," she said. "Do you know about Millbrook?" Cross said. "Texas, 1881. Silence. She did not know about Millbrook. She knew about Texas, about a partner, about a debt, and a bad man, and leaving. But she did not know the name Millbrook. Cross watched her face and read it and smiled again. "I thought not." "Whatever you're about to say," Amelia said, "say it and be done. In Millbrook, Texas, in the spring of 1881, a man named Roy Garrett, no relation to your former fiancé, I believe, died in a fire." Cross delivered this the way a man delivered a card he'd been holding. Flat and clean, and with the satisfaction of someone who has been waiting a long time to play it. "The fire took the Garrett barn 3 outbuildings and came close to taking the house. Roy Garrett got his family out, but the smoke—" He paused. "He didn't recover. Died 6 weeks later." Amelia did not look at Caleb. She kept her eyes on Cross. "And Caleb Dawson," Cross said, "was the man who built that barn. Faulty construction. A lantern hung too close to the hay shelf he'd built in the wrong position. The whole county knew it." He let the silence sit for exactly 1 beat too long. He ran before anyone could hold him to account. He's been running ever since. He looked at Caleb. Haven't you? The yard was very quiet. Amelia could hear her own heartbeat. She turned and looked at Caleb. His face had the look of a man who has been hit in a place he thought was armored and has discovered it isn't. Not guilt. She looked carefully for guilt, and what she saw was something more complicated. Grief. Old and heavy and long carried. He was looking at the ground and his jaw was tight and his hands were at his sides very still. Caleb, she said quietly. He looked up at her. Is that true? She said. Not an accusation. She said it the way she asked about barn joists. She needed to know the structure before she could know what was sound and what wasn't. He held her eyes for a long moment. The fire was my fault, he said. His voice was even. The lantern placement, I put it there. I didn't think it through. It caught a dry summer and... He stopped. Roy got sick from the smoke. He was already sick before the fire, but the smoke made it worse and he didn't get better. He paused. I went to his wife. I tried to make it right. She told me to leave. He paused again. So I left. Amelia looked at him. At the weight of 7 years on his face. At the thing he'd been carrying, not the running away, but the reason for it. Not cowardice, she thought. Something more complicated than cowardice. The particular agony of a person who has done harm they cannot undo and does not know what to do with the fact of themselves afterward. She knew something about that. In a different way. A smaller way. But she knew it. She looked back at Cross. Get off my land, she said. Cross blinked, just once quickly. Miss Carter. You came here to use a dead man's tragedy to frighten me, she said. You thought if you told me something bad about the man standing next to me, I'd send him away and you'd have me alone again. Easier to manage. She looked at him with the same steadiness she'd used in Eller's office and at the gate with the shotgun, and at every person in this valley who had decided what she was worth before she'd opened her mouth. You miscalculated. Cross looked at her. The pleasantness was entirely gone now. The note comes due in 6 weeks, he said. Harrington is not going to move faster than that. You don't have the money, and you know you don't have the money. You don't know what I have, she said. Miss Carter. Gerald, Cross said, not looking away from Amelia. Fitch reached into his coat. Caleb moved. Not fast, or rather fast, in the way that quiet men moved when they were done being quiet, which was faster than you expected, because you'd mistaken stillness for slowness. He stepped forward 1 step, and he was between Amelia and Fitch, and he looked at Fitch with the flat gray of his eyes and said very quietly, Don't. Fitch stopped. The envelope was in his hand. Just an envelope, just papers. And Amelia saw in the space of 1 second that it was not a weapon, but that Caleb had moved as if it might have been, and that this also told her something. Something about what he'd seen, and where he'd been, and what kind of situations a man moving from county to county across the Western Territories actually encountered. Fitch looked at Cross. Cross looked at Caleb. Something passed between them. A recognition, a reassessment. Like 2 men who had encountered each other across some other table in some other situation, and knew the specific texture of what the other was capable of. Harlan, Caleb said. His voice was still quiet. You're on a woman's property. You've made your offer. She's declined it. Take your men and ride. Cross was very still. This isn't finished, Dawson, he said. No, Caleb agreed. It isn't. But today it's done. Cross looked at Amelia one more time. 6 weeks, he said. It was not an offer anymore. It was a calendar. He turned his horse and his men turned with him, and Fitch was last, and as he turned, he dropped the envelope in the dirt of the yard. Deliberately, she thought the last small act of contempt available to him. She left it in the dirt. She watched them ride until they were off the property. Then she turned to Caleb, who was still facing the road. Though the riders were gone, and his hands were at his sides, and his jaw was still tight, and she could see him from the back, the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of stillness in a man who is holding himself together by will. Caleb, she said. He turned. His face was composed, controlled. But his eyes were the same eyes she'd seen when he'd talked about the family in that other state. That specific look of a man who has been found out in something he has been carrying alone for a very long time. "I should have told you," he said. "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I know." He looked past her. "I'll pack my things." "You will not," she said. He looked at her. "You are not leaving," she said. "Not because of this. Not because Harlan Cross rode onto my land and used a dead man as a weapon." She stepped toward him. "Roy Garrett died of illness that the smoke made worse, and you made a mistake with a lantern placement 7 years ago, and you have been paying for it every day since, with every road you've taken and every place you've refused to stay." Her voice was steady and clear, and she meant every word of it. "That is enough, Caleb. That is more than enough." He looked at her with an expression she would remember stripped entirely of the careful control he always kept in place, and what was underneath it was something she recognized because she had felt it herself. The desperate, uncertain face of a person who wants very badly to believe they deserve something and does not know if they're allowed to. "It was my fault," he said. "Mistakes are not the same as who you are," she said. "Or I'd be the woman Thomas Garrett left and nothing else. And I am a great deal more than that." He was quiet for a long moment. "I went back," he said. "To Millbrook. 2 years after. I went to Roy Garrett's wife. I offered everything I had. It wasn't much, but it was what I had. She wouldn't take it. She said—" He stopped. "She said she didn't want my money. She wanted me to live with it." Amelia closed her eyes briefly. "And so you did." "Every day," he said. "Then you've done what she asked," she said. "You've lived with it. Now live forward." He looked at her. She held his gaze, and she did not look away, and she did not let him look away either, because this was the thing about Caleb Dawson that she had understood from the first morning she'd seen him. Feeling the barn wall in the dark, he needed someone to stand still in front of him and not move, because the whole world had taught him that everything moved. Eventually, everything left, and the only way to make him believe that wasn't universally true was to demonstrate it. So she stood still. After a long time, he said very quietly, "You're a difficult woman to argue with." "Good," she said. "I've been practicing." The corner of his mouth moved, small and crooked and real. She picked up the envelope from the dirt and handed it to him. "Burn this," she said. He took it. "Gladly," he said. She went back inside. She sat at the kitchen table, and she put her hands flat on the wood, and she let herself feel the full trembling weight of the last hour. Cross's face. The name, Millbrook. Caleb's eyes when she'd held his gaze, and she let it pass through her, the way she'd let the 2 minutes pass in the barn, the night of the storm. All the way through. Nothing held back. Then she picked up her pencil and opened the ledger and started calculating. 6 weeks. She needed $900 in 6 weeks. She had the spring calves at market 400 if prices held. The horse pasture lease from Walt 80, with the first payment already made. Her own savings, the careful accumulation of 5 years of small surpluses, $230 in the bank that Cross didn't know about, because she'd kept it in the Billings branch, not Creekside, which was a decision her father had made, and she'd never changed. That was $710. She needed $190 more. She sat with that number for a while. Then she heard the door and looked up, and Caleb was in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand and the burned edge of the envelope's ashes on his fingers. "What do you need?" he said. She looked at him, at the straightness of him, the steadiness. $190, she said. "In 6 weeks." He sat down across from her. "Show me the ledger." She turned it around. He looked at it the way he always looked at problems, as if the problem was a thing with a shape that could be known. His finger moved down the columns slowly. She watched his face. "The North Pasture," he said. "Walt's paying monthly. First payment's in. Can you get a second tenant? Different section of the pasture." She frowned. "It's not that large. Large enough for 2 if they're horses, not cattle." He looked up. "Reverend Marsh keeps horses. I heard him tell someone at the feed store he's been looking for summer pasture. His wife's on your bad list, but he's not. He's a separate person, and he needs something you have. She stared at him. Marsh. He'll pay $60 a month. Offer him a fair rate and he'll take it. He needs the pasture more than he needs to agree with his wife's social opinions. She picked up the pencil. 60 from Marsh. That's 140, still short. Your spring calves, he said. You said 400 if prices hold. But if you bring them to market early first week of the season, rather than midpoint prices are higher. Could get 450. If they're ready early. 3 of them are ready now, he said. I've been watching them. You could market 3 early and hold the rest for the standard timing. It staggers your income and your risk. She was writing fast. That gets me to, she added the numbers. 450 plus 60 plus 80 plus 230. She looked up. 820. Plus what you earn from the extra repair work I've had inquiries about, he said. She stopped writing. What inquiries? Hank Dawes's cousin needs his barn re-sided. Walt put the word out after the documentation visit. People know the quality of the work done here. I've had 2 other inquiries. I told them I wasn't available yet. He met her eyes. If I take one of them now, the payment would go directly to you. She stared at him. You can't do that, she said. It's work I do anyway, he said. The money goes to Carter Creek. Caleb, stop, he said not unkindly. You gave me a place to stay and 3 meals a day, and you went to bat for me this morning when Cross threw Texas in your face. Let me do something that matters. She looked at him across the table. She wanted to argue, and she couldn't find the argument because she was looking at a man who was not doing this out of pity, and not doing it out of obligation, and not doing it to earn something in return. I was doing it because Carter Creek Farm had become somehow over the past 3 weeks, something that mattered to him the same way it mattered to her. She wasn't ready to say that out loud yet, but she wrote down the number. 1 job, she said. And the payment is a loan. I'll pay it back. He started to shake his head. A loan, she said. Or no deal. He looked at her for a moment. You're going to argue about everything, aren't you? Every single thing, she said. Fair warning. He almost smiled. Fine. A loan. Good, she said. She closed the ledger. Now tell me about Harrington, the real story. He put his hat on the table. A careful gesture. The hat on the table meant he was settling in for a real conversation. She'd noticed this. I did a job for him, he said. 4 years ago. He was a land surveyor then, not a railroad agent. I helped him with a contested property line situation in Colorado. Someone was trying to claim his survey was wrong, and it wasn't. I had records that proved the original measurements. He paused. We've kept in touch. He moves in the world where these things happen, and sometimes he's had use for a man who knows how to read the land and the people on it. She looked at him steadily. You're not just a barn builder. I am mostly, he said. But I know people, and I know how men like Cross work, because I've seen them work before, and I made it my business to understand it after Millbrook. He paused. That's why I recognized the pattern with Fitch. That's why I knew about the railroad. You've been doing this, she said slowly. Helping people, in the path of men like Cross. He was quiet. Caleb, it's not organized, he said. I'm not some kind of... He stopped, started again. After Millbrook, I needed to do something useful with the fact that I was still walking around. Fixing barns was honest work. And sometimes the barn I was fixing belonged to someone who needed more than a barn fixed. He looked at his hands. So I fixed what I could. She sat across from him and felt something settle in her chest. Not the fragile, careful thing she'd been nursing, but something solid and warm and sure. Roy Garrett's wife told you to live with it, she said. Yes. I think this is what living with it looks like, she said. He looked up. She held his gaze. You turned the worst thing you ever did into a reason to help people. That's not a man who should keep running. She paused. That's a man who should stop. He looked at her for a long time. Then he picked up his hat and stood. I'll go talk to Hank's cousin about the barn work, he said. Caleb. He stopped. She looked at him. Thank you. For this morning. For standing in front of me when Fitch reached into his coat. He held her gaze. That's not something you thank a man for, he said. That's just what you do. He went out. She sat at the table and looked at the ledger and the numbers, and outside the window, the day was moving toward afternoon, and somewhere in Creekside. Harlan Cross was sitting with his 6-week calendar. Let him sit. She had a plan. The next 3 weeks moved with the particular speed of difficult things, not fast in the way of good things, but fast in the way of things that took all your attention, so that you looked up one day and a lot of time had passed. Caleb took the Dawes Cousins barn job and did it in 4 days, working from first light to last, driving back to Carter Creek each evening. He didn't say much about it. He just put the money on the kitchen table at the end of it, and she wrote it in the ledger as a loan and put it in the billings account. She talked to Reverend Marsh about the north pasture. He came out on a Tuesday and walked the fence line and agreed on $60 a month without a single mention of his wife's opinions, which either meant he'd compartmentalized entirely or she suspected this. He thought his wife had been unkind and was offering her this as a quiet counterweight. She took the deal either way. The spring calves went to market in 2 waves, the first 3 early, which got her $4 ahead above the standard price, and the rest at the regular timing, which held exactly as predicted. And then on a Wednesday morning, 4 weeks after the Billings meeting, a letter arrived from the Northern Pacific Railroad, addressed to Miss Amelia Rose Carter, Carter Creek Farm, Creekside, Montana Territory. She opened it at the kitchen table with her coffee cooling beside her. She read it once, then again. Then she set it down flat on the table and put her hands over her face and sat like that for a full 30 seconds. Caleb came in for the second coffee around 7 and found her like that. Amelia. Fast. At her side in 2 steps. What happened, are you? She lifted her face. She was not crying. She was something else, something that didn't have a simple name. The particular overwhelm of a person who has been holding against a wall for so long that when the wall moves, they don't immediately know how to stand without it. She slid the letter across the table. He read it standing up. He read it again. He set it down. Northern Pacific Railroad, in consideration of the strategic value of the Carter Creek Farm corridor, was prepared to offer a formal easement negotiation with a good faith advance payment to be applied to any existing financial obligations on the property of $950 upon execution of preliminary easement terms. $950. 50 more than the note. Harrington moved, Caleb said. He moved, she said. Caleb pulled out the chair and sat down. He put his hands flat on the table, both of them, and he looked at the letter. That's it, he said. That's the note. That's Cross out of the picture. That's the note, she said. They sat with it for a moment. Then she said, he's not going to take this quietly. No, Caleb said. He's going to try one more thing. He's that kind of man. He looked at her. We need to get to Ellers before Cross does. File the payment before he can manufacture a new problem. She was already standing. How fast can you saddle the horses? Faster than you can put your boots on, he said. She almost ran to the bedroom. She was wrong. She was ready before him barely. And they rode to Creekside side by side in the early morning hard and fast, and arrived at the Territorial Bank when Ellers was still unlocking the door. He turned and saw them, and whatever he read in their faces told him this was not a social call. Mr. Ellers, Amelia said, not breathing hard, or rather breathing hard and talking anyway. I need to make a payment on my note, the full amount, right now. Ellers looked at the letter she was already holding out to him. He looked at the bank draft from the Northern Pacific that accompanied it. He looked at her. Come inside, he said. They were in the bank for 20 minutes. Fitch arrived while they were still at the window. He came through the door with the speed of a man who had received word and ridden fast, and he stopped when he saw Amelia at the window, and Ellers counting out the receipt and the Northern Pacific bank draft already in the teller's hand. He stood there for 3 seconds. Amelia turned and looked at him. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to say anything. The receipt in her hand said everything that needed to be said. Fitch looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at him with the flat gray of his eyes and nothing else. Fitch turned and walked. She heard his horse leave at a gallop. She turned back to Ellers and took the receipt he was offering her and looked at it, the full amount paid. Stamped, dated, signed, and she folded it with great care and put it in her coat pocket and pressed her hand flat against it through the wool. Done. She walked out of the bank into the morning. Caleb was beside her. She stood on the boardwalk and looked at Creekside, the feed store, the livery, the hotel where they'd planned the Billings trip, the road that led east to Carter Creek, and she felt something move through her that was not triumph, exactly, not simple relief. It was the particular feeling of a person who has stood in the place where the worst thing might happen, and the worst thing did not happen, and is now standing on the other side of it, astonished to still be upright. "It's done," she said. "It's done," Caleb said. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the road east, in the direction of Carter Creek. "He's still out there," she said. "Cross." "He is," Caleb said. "But he's out of moves on the note. He can't touch the land through the bank. The railroad deal is on record." He paused. "He could still cause trouble." "He could," she said. "But now it's his problem how to cause it." He looked at her then. "You're not going to spend 1 second being scared of him." "I spent enough seconds," she said. "I'm done with those." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite name, but she had more time now, she thought. More time to learn to name the things on Caleb Dawson's face. "Come on," she said. "I want to get home before the afternoon." She said it easily, naturally, the way you said a thing that was already true, and had always been true, and didn't require any ceremony. She didn't notice that she'd said home to both of them. He did. He was quiet for a moment, standing on the creekside boardwalk in the morning light, and then he put his hat on and turned toward the horses. "Then let's go," he said. They rode home. She was halfway up the porch steps when something made her stop and turn. Caleb was tying the horses at the rail, and she looked at him and thought about Cross in the yard that morning 4 weeks ago, and Millbrook and Roy Garrett, and 7 years of roads. And she thought about the way he'd stepped forward when Fitch reached into his coat, and how fast he'd moved, and how he hadn't even seemed to think about it. "Caleb," she said. He looked up. "I'm glad Perry told me about you," she said. "In the livery, that first day." He looked at her for a moment, something quiet and real in his face. "So am I," he said. He went to the barn. She went inside. She stood at the kitchen table and put the receipt down and put her hands flat beside it and looked at it, Carter Creek farm note, satisfied and full, dated, signed. And she thought about her father and the 2-minute rule and what he'd say if he could see this morning, this kitchen, this receipt. She thought he'd say, "I knew it. I always knew it." She picked up the receipt and walked to the window and looked out at the barn. At the roof, sound and tight. At the door swinging clean on its new hinge. At the yard, the fence, the gate, all of it. At Caleb Dawson walking toward the south stall to start the afternoon work. She stood at the window for a while. Then she folded the receipt, placed it in the tin box where she kept her father's deed and her mother's letters, locked the box, and put it back on the shelf. She put on her work coat. She went out to help with the afternoon. Cross sent a letter 3 days later. No Fitch this time, just a letter, formal and cold, informing her that the Carter Creek easement agreement was under review by certain legal interests and that she should not consider the matter resolved. She read it at the kitchen table with Caleb across from her. When she finished, she looked at him. "He's bluffing," Caleb said. "The easement is on record with the railroad. There's nothing to review. He's just—" He paused. "He needs to feel like he still has a move." "Does he?" she said. "No," Caleb said, flat and certain. She folded the letter. "Then we ignore it." "Yes," he said. She put the letter in the stove. They watched it burn. Then she made dinner, and they ate at the kitchen table, and afterward he sat on the bunkhouse step and smoked his pipe, and she came out and leaned against the post, and they watched the Montana dark come in from the east, slow and enormous, and full of stars, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Then he said, "I've been here 6 weeks." "I know," she said. "Longest I've stayed anywhere in 7 years," he said. She looked at the stars. "How does it feel?" A pause. Long, honest. "Like something I don't have a word for," he said. She nodded. That's how it's supposed to feel, she said. When it's real. He pulled on his pipe. The stars were very close. The barn stood solid against the dark sky, and Carter Creek Farm, which had been a failing thing 6 weeks ago, breathed in the night air, like something that had decided firmly and for good to stay alive. The storm came on a Thursday, not the slow kind that built for days and gave you time to prepare. The fast kind, the kind that dropped out of a clear afternoon like a punishment, dark and sudden and mean. Amelia was in the south pasture when she felt the air change and looked up and saw the wall of weather coming in from the northwest and felt her stomach drop straight to her boots. The barn, the new roof, the repaired wall. 8 weeks of Caleb's work standing between Carter Creek's hay and another catastrophe, exactly like the one that had started all of this. She was running before she finished the thought. She came into the yard shouting his name, and he was already at the barn doors, which told her he'd seen it too, because Caleb Dawson always saw what was coming before it arrived. "How bad?" she called. "Bad enough," he called back. "Get the cattle in." She went for the cattle. He went for the barn. They worked in opposite directions for 20 minutes, her pushing the herd in from the east pasture, while the sky went from gray to green to that particular sickly yellow that meant the wind was about to do something serious. She got the last cow through the gate and latched it and turned, and the first real gust hit her full in the face, hard enough to make her stagger. She ran for the barn. Caleb was on the roof. She stopped dead in the yard and looked up, and her heart seized. He was up there in the rising wind, moving along the ridgeline, checking the joints he'd set 8 weeks ago, pressing and testing with his hands the way he always tested things. "Get down," she shouted. "Give me 2 minutes," he shouted back. "Caleb, 2 minutes." She stood in the yard with the wind tearing at her coat and watched him move along the roof with the careful, deliberate focus of a man who had built the thing and knew every inch of it and needed to know with his own hands whether it was going to hold. He came down the ladder fast when he finished. "Well," she said. "She'll hold," he said. She let out the breath she'd been holding. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." He took her arm, and they went into the barn, and he pulled the door behind them, and the storm hit the outside of it like a freight train. They stood in the dark of the barn, with the cattle shifting around them, and the wind hammering the walls, and the roof groaning in the way. New wood groaned. Not the creak of failing wood, but the flecks of sound wood under pressure, doing what it was built to do. She looked up at the roof. It held. For 2 hours, the storm screamed and the barn held, and she and Caleb worked side by side in the dark, checking the cattle, calming the ones that spooked moving hay, away from a small leak at the north corner that she'd have to look at in the morning. They didn't talk much. There was no need to talk. They moved around each other the way two people moved when they knew each other's rhythms, anticipating adjusting, each doing what needed doing, without direction or explanation. Somewhere in the middle of the second hour, in the particular dark and noise of the storm, she became aware of something. That this right here, right now, was what her life looked like when it was working. Not in spite of the hardship, but straight through it, shoulder to shoulder, with someone who had chosen to stand there. Both of them doing the work, neither of them making the other smaller. She held on to that thought. At just past 9, the storm broke. Not gradually, it broke. The way fast. Storms broke all at once. The noise cutting off and the silence coming in behind it like a held breath. Caleb opened the barn door, and they both stood in the doorway and looked out at Carter Creek Farm in the aftermath. The yard was wet and scattered with leaves and small debris. The chicken yard gate was open, and she'd deal with that in the morning. The porch step, the one he'd fixed, the solid one, had a branch across it that she could move in 10 seconds. The barn stood. Everything stood. She looked at the roof, and then at him, and then at the roof again. "You were right," she said. "I usually am about wood," he said. She laughed. It surprised her, a short, real, completely unguarded laugh that she hadn't planned and couldn't have stopped if she'd tried. And he looked at her when she laughed with an expression that she was finally able to name. It was the look of a man who had found something he hadn't known he was looking for, and was only now allowing himself to understand what it was. She stopped laughing. They stood in the barn doorway in the quiet after the storm and looked at each other and the thing that had been building between them for 8 weeks, careful and slow, and neither of them naming it was suddenly very present and very close and not careful anymore. "Caleb," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to stay," she said. "I need you to know that. I'm not. I've never once tried to hold you here. Everything you've done has been your choice, and I need it to stay your choice." "I know that too," he said. "I just want to know," she said, and her voice was steady. She kept it steady. "What you want, not what you think you should do, not what makes sense, what you actually want." Long silence. The wet Montana night was enormous around them. He looked at Carter Creek Farm, the barn, the yard, the house with the lamp burning in the kitchen window that she'd left on when she ran out to the pasture. He looked at all of it the way she'd caught him looking at it before in unguarded moments when he didn't know she was watching. Like a man looking at something he was trying to memorize before it went away. He looked at her. "I want to stop running," he said. "I want to wake up in the same place I went to sleep. I want to fix things that are mine to fix, because I'll still be here tomorrow to see if they hold." He paused. "I want—" He stopped, started again. You'd, he said. "Specifically. Not the farm, not a place to belong, not an idea. You, Amelia." She didn't say anything for a moment. She just looked at him. Then she stepped forward and closed the space between them, and she put her hand against his face, and he went very still, the way he went still when something was real and needed to be felt properly. "Then stop running," she said quietly. "You're already home." He covered her hand with his, and that was that. They didn't announce it. There was no announcement to make Caleb Dawson simply stopped being the man in the bunkhouse and started being the man at the kitchen table in the morning. The man who knew where the coffee cups were and how she took hers and which of the south pasture fence posts needed attention before the fall. It happened the way the important things on Carter Creek Farm had always happened, gradually, and then all at once, and then as if it had always been. The town noticed, of course. The town always noticed. Dorothea Hale made a point of riding past the farm 3 mornings in a row, which was not on her way to anywhere, and Amelia was aware of being watched and found that she didn't much care. She had crossed some line in herself, she couldn't have said exactly when, where other people's opinions of her life had become genuinely irrelevant. Not as a defense she was holding up, but as a true thing, a settled thing, something she'd worked her way to on the other side of a lot of hard months. It was Clara Dawes who said it plainly, which was Clara's way. She came out to Carter Creek on a Tuesday and sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and looked at Amelia and said, "You're happy." "I am," Amelia said. "I can see it," Clara said. "It looks different on you. Not different bad, different right. Like you finally stopped trying to look a particular way and just—" She gestured. Amelia thought about that. "I think that's what happens when someone sees you," she said. "Really sees you. Not what they want you to be or what they've decided you are, but actually you." She looked at her coffee cup. "I forgot what that felt like. I didn't know I'd forgotten until it happened again." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, Thomas Garrett got married again. Amelia looked up. "Susan Pruitt's girl," Clara said carefully. From over by Bozeman, Amelia waited for the old contracted feeling and found nothing. No grief, no retroactive wound, no complicated residue. Just the mild, distant recognition of a fact that had nothing to do with her life. "I hope they're happy," she said, and meant it. Clara looked at her with the expression of a woman doing a rapid internal reassessment. Then she smiled. "You really are done with all that?" "I really am," Amelia said. It was 3 weeks after the storm on a bright October morning, when the air had that first cold edge that said winter was forming its intentions somewhere to the north, that Jed Ankers rode out to Carter Creek one last time. He came slower than his previous visits. Not the lathered urgency of a man with a warning, but the careful pace of a man with something to say that he hadn't yet figured out how to say. He pulled up at the gate, and Amelia went out, and he sat on his horse and turned his hat in his hands in a way she recognized from a long time ago. "Jed," she said. Miss Carter. He looked at his hat. I quit the cross operation. She waited. What he did trying to take your land, the bank business, sending men to Billings. He shook his head. I knew it was wrong when I was in it, and I stayed too long. He looked up at her. I want to apologize. For my part in it. Even the small part. She looked at him. He was younger than she sometimes thought under the weathered look of a ranch hand. 22, maybe 23. Old enough to know better, and young enough that it mattered that he'd figured it out. You came to warn me twice, she said. At considerable risk to yourself. That doesn't make up for the rest of it. No, she said. But it's what you did with the moment you had. That counts. She looked at him steadily. What are you going to do now? He shrugged. Looking for work. She looked at him for a moment, then back at the farm. Caleb had been talking about the north fence line for 2 weeks, the section that would need serious work before winter. 2 men could do it in 3 days. 1 man would take a week. Caleb, she called. He appeared at the barn door. Come out here a minute, she said. He came. He looked at Jed without the flat watchfulness he'd had toward Cross's men. Just a straight assessing look. The kind he used on wood reading the grain. Jed needs work, Amelia said. The north fence needs 2 men. Caleb looked at Jed. You know fence work. Yes, sir, Jed said. You follow direction. Yes, sir. Caleb looked at Amelia. She looked back at him. 2 weeks' work to start, Caleb said to Jed. Fair wages. You work out there, might be more after. He paused. I run this operation the right way. If you have a problem with anything, you say it to my face. Jed looked from Caleb to Amelia and back. Something moved through his face, relief maybe, or something adjacent to it. The expression of a young man who has been working for a bad person long enough that working for a decent one felt unfamiliar and enormously welcome. Yes, sir, he said. Thank you. He tied his horse at the fence and went to find his work gloves, and Amelia stood in the yard and watched him go and then looked at Caleb. You just hired someone, she said. You told me to come out here, he said. I didn't tell you to hire him. No, he said. You suggested it without saying it. Same way you do most things. He looked at her. He's a good kid who made a bad choice and then made a better one. You know something about people like that? She held his gaze. So do you. He looked away first, but not before she saw it again, that expression. The one she could name now. She let it be. Cross's legal threat, which he'd sent in that cold formal letter 3 days after they'd paid the note, came to nothing. Harrington had told her it would come to nothing, and Caleb had told her it would come to nothing. And by November, a letter arrived from the Northern Pacific's legal office, confirming that the easement agreement was proceeding without complication, and that any competing claims had been reviewed and dismissed. She read the letter at the kitchen table. She looked out the window. She did not feel triumph. She felt the quiet, solid satisfaction of a thing completed the way she imagined Caleb felt when he drove the last nail in a roof and stood back, and the whole thing was true and level and ready for whatever came. She thought she understood him better for that. That evening, she did something she'd been thinking about for weeks, but hadn't yet done. She went to the shelf where she kept the tin box, the one with her father's deed and her mother's letters, and she took out the deed and spread it on the table. Harold Carter's name was on it, his signature strong and looping at the bottom of the page. She got a fresh pen. She dipped it. Below her father's signature, she wrote her own. Amelia Rose Carter. The ink was dark and certain, and it dried while she watched it, and she sat there for a long time, looking at both names on the same page, his above hers below, and the line between them felt less like a gap and more like a continuation. He had built this. She was keeping it. Both things were true at the same time, and neither one diminished the other. She heard Caleb's boots on the porch, and she covered the deed with her hand, not to hide it, just instinctively, and then changed her mind and left it uncovered. And when he came in and looked at the table, she watched his face while he read both names. He was quiet for a moment. Good, he said. Just that. Good. In the way he said things that mattered, short, certain, no ornamentation. She put the deed back in the box and locked it, and put it back on the shelf. She made dinner. They ate, and he washed up, and she dried, and they worked around each other in the kitchen with the ease of two people who had figured out the specific geography of sharing a space. And at some point, she became aware that they were talking about something. The cattle rotation, the north fence progress, Jed's work quality. And she thought about the fact that 6 months ago, she'd sat at this table alone and done the arithmetic of how long she had before everything was gone, and the numbers had come up short every single time. The numbers were different now. Not just because of the railroad easement, though, that had been the turning point, but because she'd stopped trying to hold everything alone and had let people in. Caleb Walt, Hank Jed, even Clara, and the weight of the farm distributed across more hands was a weight that could be carried. Her father had known that. He'd had neighbors who helped him, and he'd helped back, and that was how a farm survived long term. She'd forgotten it in her grief, in her isolation, in the years of people looking at her and deciding what she wasn't. She had remembered it again. In November, a second letter arrived from the Northern Pacific, this one containing the formal easement agreement, and a request that she appear in Billings to execute it. She went. Caleb went with her. Walt came for the occasion because Walt had been there for everything and wasn't about to miss the ending. Harrington shook her hand at the table, and she signed the easement in the same deliberate way she'd signed the deed. Her full name, dark and certain, and Harrington countersigned, and the railroad's legal representative countersigned, and it was done. The easement payment cleared the Billings bank account the following Tuesday. She took out exactly the amount Caleb had loaned her from the barn job and put it in an envelope and set it on the kitchen table that evening. He looked at it. "Your loan," she said. He picked it up, looked at it. "Amelia." "We said it was a loan," she said. "A deal is a deal." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he put the envelope in his shirt pocket. "All right," he said. She poured the coffee. "There's something else," she said. He looked up. She put a second envelope on the table. This one was sealed and had his name on the front in her handwriting. He picked it up slowly. "Open it," she said. He opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, not a legal document, nothing formal, just her handwriting on farm letterhead. She'd written it 3 times before she'd gotten the words right. He read it. His face went very still. She had written, "In recognition of 8 weeks of honest labor and honest character, Carter Creek Farm offers Caleb Dawson a permanent working partnership, equal voice in operations, equal share in future proceeds, and a permanent place on this land for as long as he chooses to stay. This is not charity and not sentiment. It is what is fair and what is true. Amelia Rose Carter." He set the paper down on the table very carefully. He looked at it. She waited. "Amelia," he said. His voice was very quiet. "It's a business arrangement," she said. "With feelings, but primarily a business arrangement." He looked up at her. "You put primarily," he said. "I stand by that characterization," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "You thought very carefully about this." "I thought about nothing else for 2 weeks." He looked at the paper again. His hand moved and then stopped, and she could see him working through something, the old arithmetic, the old calculation, the numbers he'd been running since Texas that always came out to, he didn't deserve something like this. She'd seen that calculation before. "Caleb," she said. He looked up. "You fixed the barn," she said. "You fixed the gate and the step and the water trough and the fence, and you helped me save this farm from a man who'd been planning to take it for years. You came to Billings when it was dangerous, and you stood in front of me when Fitch reached into his coat, and you've been at the work every single day since you got here." She held his eyes. "You have been the person this farm needed. You are the person I—" She stopped, took a breath. "You are the person I want to build this with, and that's not charity. That's just the truth." Very long silence. He looked at the paper. He looked at his hands. He looked at her. I carved something today," he said. She blinked. "What?" He stood up and she followed him out to the barn, and he took the lantern from the hook and held it up to the south stall door, the one he'd repaired in the first week, the first thing she'd noticed him fix without being asked. She looked. In the wood of the door, carved in small, neat letters, Amelia and Caleb, Carter Creek, 1888. She put her hand over it, over both names, felt the carved lines under her palm. She looked at him. He was watching her with everything unguarded, no careful control, no held distance. Just Caleb Dawson, looking at her, the way he'd wanted to look at her since that first morning in the barn doorway, when she'd said, "Don't tell me what else needs fixing, just to stay." "I carved it this morning," he said, "before I knew about the paper." "I know," she said. "I was going to tell you tonight," he said, "that I'd made my decision, that I didn't need a formal arrangement or a business agreement to know I wasn't going anywhere." He paused. "Though I appreciate the primarily." She laughed again, that same unguarded laugh, the one she hadn't been able to stop the first time either. He smiled. The full version this time. The version she'd been waiting for since the first morning. It was a good smile. She'd been right to wait for it. She took the partnership paper out of her pocket. She'd brought it from the table, she'd known she would, and she put it against the door beside the carved names, and he put his hand over hers, and they stood like that in the lamplight for a moment. "Home," she said. "Home," he said. Then she heard it hoofbeats on the road coming fast, and her instincts were still what they were, after the last several months, so she tensed. Caleb tensed too. They went to the barn door. It was Jed. Coming from the direction of town fast but not panicked. He pulled up at the gate and she could see even at distance that his face was not afraid, it was something else. Animated, urgent, but good. "Miss Carter," he said, "you need to come to town, both of you." "What happened?" Caleb said. "Cross," Jed said. "The county sheriff from Billings came in this afternoon. Warrants." He was catching his breath. "Apparently your Harrington fellow talked to some people about the pattern of cross-acquiring land through bank pressure. There are 3 other families who came forward." He looked at Amelia. "The sheriff wants your testimony, the documentation about the maintenance clause and Fitch's visits." He paused. "They've got him, Miss Carter. They've actually got him." Silence. She looked at Caleb. He looked at her. She thought about Gerald Fitch's cold, patient smile. She thought about the name Cross had said Millbrook and the way he'd used a dead man as a weapon. She thought about 3 other families she didn't know on land they'd fought to keep, who had apparently been through versions of the same fight she'd had, and who had maybe lost. "When does the sheriff need us?" she said. "Tomorrow morning," Jed said. "Creekside Courthouse." "We'll be there," she said. Jed nodded and turned his horse and rode back, and she and Caleb stood in the gate of Carter Creek Farm in the October dark. "It's not over yet," she said. "No," he agreed. But the shape of it changed. She thought about what that meant. Cross not just losing his play on Carter Creek, but actually being held to account for the pattern. The whole accumulated weight of what he'd done to how many families over how many years. She thought about the 3 she didn't know. She thought about Jed, 22 years old, who had made a better choice when it mattered. She thought about her father, who had believed that right things done, persistently and honestly, eventually came around to right outcomes. She hoped he was somewhere where he could see this. She thought he probably was. In the morning they rode to Creekside. She gave the sheriff's deputy everything, the documentation, Walt's signed statement, Fitch's visits, the dates, the bank letter, Cross's appearance in the yard, all of it. Caleb gave his own statement about the pattern he'd seen in other states, other counties, other versions of this same scheme. Walt came in without being asked, because that was who Walt was, and he sat across from the deputy and said his piece with the calm authority of a man who had nothing to hide and no patience for people who did. It took 2 days. At the end of the second day, the deputy shook Amelia's hand and thanked her and told her the case would proceed, and that she should expect to hear from the county attorney. She walked out of the courthouse into the November morning. Caleb was beside her. Walt was on her other side. She stood on the courthouse steps and looked at Creekside, the feed store, the livery, the bank with its clean painted sign. And she thought about the first time she'd ridden into this town, looking for a man to fix her barn. How small she'd felt in this town for how long. How certain everyone here had been about what she was capable of and what she wasn't. "You all right?" Caleb said. Yes, she said, and meant it completely. Walt clapped her on the shoulder with the affectionate force of a man who thought of her as something close to a daughter. Harold would have loved this, he said. He would have, she said. He'd have had opinions about every single step of it. Loudly, Walt agreed. She smiled. They rode home. She was quiet most of the ride, and Caleb didn't push her to talk, which was one of the many things she had come to rely on his ability to know when silence was the right thing. He rode beside her and let the Montana morning be the morning, and let her thoughts be her thoughts. When they came over the last rise, and Carter Creek Farm appeared below them, the barn, the house, the fence lines, the south pasture, where the last of the cattle were moving through the cold grass, she pulled her horse up without planning to. She just stopped and looked. "What?" Caleb said. "Nothing," she said. I want to look at it for a minute." He pulled up beside her. They sat on their horses on the rise above Carter Creek Farm and looked at it in the November morning light, and she thought about the storm and the ruined hay and the bank letter in her apron pocket and the shotgun she'd pointed at Fitch and the kitchen table full of ledgers and the carved names on the barn door and the receipt folded in the tin box and the easement document in the billings office with her name on it. She thought about 2 minutes. She thought about what her father had said after "What do we do next?" "We figured out what to do next," she said. Caleb looked at her. "What?" "Something my father used to say." She kept her eyes on the farm. "He'd ask me when things were hard, 'What do we do next?' And the answer was always, 'We figure out what to do next.'" She paused. "I spent so long after he died thinking that the we was gone, that it was just me, trying to figure things out alone." He was quiet. She looked at him. "It's not just me anymore." He held her gaze. "No," he said. "It's not." She turned her horse down the rise toward home. He turned his horse and rode beside her. They came into the yard, and she unsaddled her horse, and he unsaddled his, and they worked in the easy parallel quiet that she didn't have to think about anymore. It was just how it was. And afterward she made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table in the November morning, and it was ordinary, and it was hers. Both things at once. That evening she got the tin box off the shelf, and she took out her father's deed, and she looked at both names. Harold Carter, above Amelia Rose. Carter below, and then she picked up the pen and dipped it. She wrote below her own name and Caleb Dawson. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put the deed back in the box and closed the lid. She didn't say anything about it. She would show him in the morning. Tonight she just sat at the kitchen table and listened to Carter Creek Farm, the cattle settling the wind, moving through soundwood, the barn door swinging easy on its hinge, and she knew down to the bone that this was her life, the real one, the one she had fought for and kept and would keep, not the life that Creekside had decided she deserved. Not the life Thomas Garrett had decided she wasn't worth. Not the diminished, careful life of a woman who had accepted other people's measurements of her. Her life, her land, her terms. Chosen freely, held honestly, and shared finally at last, and permanently, with someone who had stopped running and decided that this was worth staying for. Some people spent a whole life looking for the place they belonged and died without finding it. Caleb Dawson had found it under a broken barn roof in a Montana spring, and Amelia Carter had found it by refusing one more time, and then one more time after that, and then one final time when it mattered most to let anyone tell her what she was worth. Carter Creek Farm stood, and so did they.